There goes summer. 7:34 p.m. or a.m. Excuse me, 7:34 a.m. And this is the Edina Housing Redevelopment Authority meeting at the City Hall Council Chambers. And I think you've been instructed that there's a chance to participate in community comment this morning. You can call in the number. I think that'll come up on the screen momentarily. And we get to that part of the agenda fairly quickly, so people should be writing these numbers down so they can call in if they have a concern that they want to discuss with the HRA that's not on the agenda this morning or otherwise scheduled for a future public hearing before the HRA. So having provided that information, I'll call the meeting to order and ask our Administrative Planning Specialist, Liz Olson, to call the roll.
Commissioner Risser.
Here.
Commissioner Jackson.
Here.
Commissioner Pierce.
Here.
Commissioner Agnew.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. Next is the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we have a form of meeting agenda. Is there anyone that wishes to modify the agenda in any form or fashion? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the meeting agenda as shown.
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves.
Second.
Commissioner Agnew seconds the adoption of the meeting agenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adopting the meeting agenda as published, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. The meeting agenda is adopted. And next, community comment. We are back up at time for community comment. And do we have anyone in the audience that wishes to address the HRA on a matter of concern to them that's not on the agenda or otherwise scheduled for a future public hearing? Hearing nothing and seeing no one coming forward, do we have anybody online?
I do not have anyone online, but because there is a slight delay in the broadcast, I would recommend we wait a minute or so before moving on. My clock shows that it's 7:34, so I will come back to you at 7:35 or when I have a caller, whichever is first.
Thank you.
What is assuredly one of the longest minutes of your day has now passed, and you may move on with the agenda.
All right, very good. Thank you. Our practice is to have the executive director respond to community comments that were made at the prior meeting. Our executive director, also our city manager, the same position, different hats. Anything to comment on there?
There's nothing to comment on.
There's only one item on the consent agenda, and that's the draft minutes of the regular meeting of June 13th, 2024. Is there a motion to adopt the draft minutes of the regular meeting of June 13, 2024 for the HRA?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves. Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the draft minutes, or the minutes of the regular meeting of June 13, 2024. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adopting the minutes of the regular meeting on June 13, 2024, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. Those minutes are adopted, and then we'll move on to reports and recommendations. We got some interesting things to discuss this morning. And the first one up is the continuing work that started a couple of years ago, and we had the opportunity to look at two pieces of property across the street from each other on France Avenue, kind of co-developing. And so it gave us a chance to think about how to get people safely across France Avenue. And Bill Neuendorf, our Economic Development Director, and others have been working on this concept since then and visiting with the county since it's a county road, and we're interested in this concept update. So, Mr. Neuendorf, welcome this morning.
Yes, good morning. As you mentioned here this morning with an update, for the last several months, the city has been working with the engineers and planners at LHB to bring this concept to greater clarity. Still a long way to go as we refine this, but we've met numerous times with transportation officials at Hennepin County, There's been a lot of engineering work and a lot of collaboration between the property owners and developers on both sides of the street, as well as their engineering teams and their design teams. So we wanted to give you a brief update this morning. We've scheduled about 20 minutes this morning. I know this is a big picture, it's a big concept. So we've also scheduled a work session in 2 weeks to have a further discussion, just because we had limited time today. But I'd like to introduce Mike Fisher with LHB and Brad Reifsteck, also with LHB. They've been the two key principals working on this effort. They'll provide an update this morning and be available for any questions.
All right, very good. Thanks, Mr. Newendorf. Fisher, good to see you again. We saw each other last night.
Good to see you. Commissioners, Chair, staff, thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're going to keep this very brief, but the last time, I believe Michael Schroeder and I were here talking about this concept. And so Brad Reifsteck and I are here. Brad is the engineer on our team who is leading, actually coordinating with our bridge engineers and our transportation engineers to find out, is this feasible? So we drew some pretty pictures and get people excited about what's possible, but is it feasible? So we're in that process, and we just want to share where we're at with it. If you recall, one of the diagrams you saw last time we met was, we talked about, well, could we come through the middle of this development and drop down and get under the street? And in the conversations with the developer, they preferred to keep their central plaza at grade level and asked if we could get creative and make the parkway. And that concept showed, creating bridges and coming down at a below grade through both developments. In working with the developer, last time we were here, we talked about this new South Parkway, South Promenade idea where they could keep their central plaza at grade and we drop down around the south. And that's where you directed us to go off and determine, is this feasible? Is this idea doable? So I'm happy to report that today it feels pretty doable. So the one thing we talked about at that last meeting also was using the model of the York Avenue bridges, where you're really creating a series of two bridges with space in between, making it feel not so much like a tunnel. These are the most current drawings depicting both developments, each side of the street. And here in the middle is just a very light drawing of where we're at right now with what we'll call the France Avenue crossing. We're still below the street, not above. We're not looking at a bridge. We're looking at two bridges on France Avenue, but that you would walk under them. And I'm going to ask Brad to talk a little bit about the engineering. And one thing I want to say is you probably look at these drawings and think, Mike, what have you done? What have you spent your time on? There are very few, did you draw much? And the reality is every line here represents multiple meetings and, meeting with the developers and their design teams and the county multiple times and talking about every little nuance, every inch we can get, because the goal is, what we're trying to do is create as much space between the bridges as we can get, essentially. So Brad, why don't you cover a little bit of the engineering?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So this first drawing depicts the construction limits that would have to occur on France Avenue to build the underpass. The areas in yellow are the roadway reconstruction areas, and the areas that are highlighted in red are either medians or curb and gutter. So as you can see from this drawing here, the start of reconstruction is just south of the intersection of Gallagher and then just north of 72nd Street. So I should mention too that the southbound lanes on France Avenue would not change geometrically. The lane widths and the turn lane from France Avenue onto Gallagher would not change. The slight changes to geometry would happen on the north side. Those changes would happen at the center median. We've been able to identify a taper that's striped today with just pavement markings, and we're taking that area and building it into a permanent concrete median, and then we're shortening the right turn lane that goes into the old Macy's site in Byerly's there. So horizontally, there's not too many changes. Again, this is primarily driven by the vertical changes in France Avenue. So this next drawing is the depiction below is the vertical profile that will be changing. Again, the dashed line that's faint there is the existing grade of France Avenue. The existing low point is just north of the new underpass. What we're proposing to do is, again, go over the underpass, raise the road about 7 feet, and what that causes is a couple new low points, one just north of the intersection of Gallagher and one just north of the intersection of 72nd Avenue. The next slide is just the typical section at the new underpass. Again, France Avenue southbound lane configurations have not changed horizontally. We've been able to gain a little space again at the median. Currently it's about 4.5 feet, so we've been able to gain approximately 5 feet there. And then again, we're reducing the right turn lane into Byerly's, and so you do not see the right turn lane on this depiction of the typical section.
I just want to point out, the two red verticals in the middle, it's the two bridges, that's the gap in between that Brad's talking about. And I want you to just focus on that for a minute, because later I'm going to come back and talk about that space.
And then the next slide, excuse me, is the profile for the underpass. Beginning on the left-hand side at the new development of 7250, we've been able to try to match the grades that they are proposing pretty closely. The profile would go downhill down to a low point just short of France Avenue, collect the stormwater for the underpass, and then go back up to the other side to 7235. So again, this is the underpass is approximately 12 feet with a 12-foot opening, and so we were able to try to match as closely as we could to the developer's plan. So with that said, I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Brad.
Yep.
So I wanted you to make sure you knew that there were actual engineers looking at this, not just Michael and I dreaming, okay? There's some credibility. So one thing, so I'm going to talk about, remember I just pointed out that median space. What do you do between these two bridges? If you think about the Lowry Avenue bridges, it's like 30 feet of open air and benches, and that's the way that feels. One thing we've learned in working with the county, we tried every which way to widen that space as much as we could here, and they're really not interested in shortening, and one of them would have required us shortening the left turn lane as you go south into the Pinstripes development, and they really don't want that shortened. So we're working with every parameter, and Brad's been, every inch of elevation has ripple effects, whether you're raising the road, widening, any of that. So we feel like, we've got the amount of space we're going to get in that median, so what do we do with it? So I started working on a little bit of a lighting study. What are the precedents out there for, do you just let it be open space, open to the sky? Or do you actually do something really interesting in how you bring light down in there between the bridges? But more importantly, maybe at night when it's lit up from underneath, what you create on the street? What kind of iconic element could you create that tells people there's something special going on here? So we've been looking at some studies, and I'm not going to get into a lot of it today, but just know that as you walk under these bridges, it's not just gray concrete that you're feeling. It could be interesting light, and it could be lit well, and it could be painted bright colors, so it feels better. I'm just going to share a couple diagrams. And these are diagrams. This isn't design of pathways, but one of the things the county said is they'd like to see in the future bike lanes. We, of course, suggested that would be great to do on France Avenue where you have way too many car lanes. But right now they just want us to allow where bike lanes would happen. So on the upper part of this image, that gray could be a future bike lane. The pink is more of a sidewalk for pedestrians. On the south side, or the bottom of this image, which is the east side of the street, the blue, we're showing shared pedestrian and bike ways, and so that's a pretty wide, again, it's the actual design might be different paths, it's just that's the zone that you would do it in. So what we're showing with all those spot elevations is we can make this work. You can get down, when Brad lifts the street up, we can get under the street in a reasonable elevations. And then the pink, again, is more of the traditional sidewalk. When we met with the developer's landscape architect team on Friday, it was a great brainstorming session and a lot. So this diagram was in place until Friday of last week. And then we made some revisions. They shared more information about the development, the design of the development on the east side, and said, you can bring that sidewalk up. It would be really appropriate to kind of make it easier and less grade, because before we were going down a little to come up a little. So here, and where future restaurants could be located and everything, so it's kind of exciting. So what we're trying to do is get the sidewalk as you're walking up France Avenue, rises up at the same level as their plaza, which is wonderful. Like you just kind of could flow in or keep going by. And meanwhile, the parkway could be dropping down from both north and south with a wonderful set of stairs that's really about people gathering, and it's walking up and down the stairs, but it's also stairs as a place of interest. And on the west side, same kind of concept where we want to separate the sidewalk from the bridge so it's not extending how much time you're under there, and creating an interesting element. But the developers, we're talking about, they want to have activities on the first floor of their buildings that you might be sitting outside. And so you can see we sort of wrapped that first floor space around, so you would have multiple layers of activity. Again, these are still diagram stage. Just a few bird's eye views, and I ask you to think of this as a really rough diagram because things wouldn't be this rigid, right? In this model, it's like using an axe instead of a scalpel here. So what you would see, this is if you're flying above the east side of France Avenue looking north, we just want to show how this can drop down, yet the sidewalk can stay at that level, how the stairs can drop down, and then sort of an iconic feature in the center of France Avenue. This isn't what it'll look like necessarily, just illustrating what could happen. And if you look at the west side, you can see again where we've separated that sidewalk, and it's actually showing how the bike lane and the sidewalk can join together to cross the bridge and move on. This is just sort of hovering over the west side just to give you a slightly different perspective. Again, all of the grades will work. And again, when you look at the building masses, just for the developer's sake, we are not trying, it's just a chunk of space. We're not trying to represent any heights or anything they're doing there. And then this is just a view standing on the west side, looking east under the bridges. And one of the ideas of and by the way, from an engineering perspective, we're able to do this at a dimension where it's like a 30-foot bridge. It's about as basic as you can get. So we can keep the cost of that pretty reasonable, but we can still create a curving element on the north side so the actual curvature follows how you want to move through this. And so you can create this flowing kind of feel. Here you can see, you're already looking through, you can see the stairs going up the other side, so it's not this long, dark tunnel necessarily. And we're just illustrating opportunities you can have. The walls of this could have inlaid artwork. We're playing with ceiling plane. Again, this is a very crude model, but the idea, when we start playing with light, the natural light coming through can be pretty interesting, but also the artificial light in there, without looking at light fixtures, I think we can have, it's just very, very artistic and very flowing kind of space. So all of that would be designed in the future, but as we sit here today, we haven't found any fatal flaws in this working. Elevations work, utilities work, everything seems to work fine. So that's our check-in, and we're here for any questions you might have.
Questions for Mike Fisher? Yes, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a really detailed question, but I always worry about graffiti in spaces like this. And so as you design this, I hope that you think about how it can be easily cleaned, how it can deter graffiti and stuff, because I would hate to have something beautiful put in and then be grimy within a year or two. So just long-term preventing grime, because you've got soot from the cars going by and oil and stuff, and then also graffiti. And so I want to make sure that this space feels clean and welcoming into the future.
Commissioner Pierce.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So first off, I really appreciate the thoroughness. Even though you said it's an abbreviated presentation, I think you guys did a very thorough job of expressing your thoughts and how you kind of see this coming together. So I definitely appreciate that. I think it does have a chance to be very iconic in that space. And so I definitely like that. I know we talked about, is there a way you can have more of these gathering types of spaces? And I think in what you're sharing, you definitely are accomplishing that. I had two questions. One, on this view, you talked about the bringing the pedestrian traffic together on the sidewalk. I think it was the one before that. You kind of had two sidewalks. Can you describe, so that I have a better understanding of how, if I'm a cyclist, I would get under the bridge? Because on the other view, and I get that this is just a visual, you've got people on both sides.
Yeah.
So how would the bike traffic go from one side to the other?
So that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because what we're showing here is a response that we had to the county, who said, yeah, what you're doing is great, but in the future we might want bike lanes up and down France Avenue. So we're showing how that can happen in the future.
Yeah.
That's really a future bike lane. But when you're coming from the west, you know what? I wish I should have shown maybe a bigger view. But when you're coming on the regional trail from the west along Gallagher, the Wooner, the developer street on the west side of their development, you'll come right down there and right underneath, and then up the other side. Or if you want to be on the west side on France Avenue, or if you're coming down 72nd, same thing. You can walk down and through, or you can stay at the upper level just by staying on the sidewalks that come around the front.
Okay.
So you have all opportunities that way.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for that. The second question, can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking of ADA as you're designing? Sometimes we kind of have a habit of, we do a design and then almost kind of closer to after the fact, we go, all right, for ADA, we need to convert these steps to switchback, and then it works. And so can you describe how you're thinking about ADA in the base of the design work you're doing?
Absolutely. So actually the diagram that's up right now is a good example. You see all the little point elevations. Those are there for exactly that reason. We want to make sure that at every point we have to stay under certain percent grades, so you don't need a railing or anything. You know, this is, our ideal is to stay under 5% grade, so everyone can move about. I will tell you that so originally, I didn't think we were going to be able to pull off the ability to get from the upper level down below coming from the north. I thought you would have to take the sidewalk, then loop all the way back down. But Michael's been working really hard on, from that north, the blue line from the north, of making that work through with ADA as well. So it'd be a real bonus to come from both sides. And so that's very much what we're doing. In fact, it's interesting when I talk about ripple effects. So right now we're debating, could we make those paths even better if we lift the grade of the as you're going under the bridges up by 1 foot? So then we go to Brad and it's like, okay, 1 more foot, Brad. And then if he lifts that, how does that impact the first floor of the developer's projects? Because we have to balance with those too, right? We already have an approved project on the west side with a certain floor level, and right now that's all working really well. We want to match what Patrick's group's doing on their plaza through the center. So all of It's like threading a needle is what it's like, and making sure that we're covering the utilities appropriately that are running under France Avenue. So right now, we have a little bit of room, and we're feeling like confident that if we went into design, it would work fine.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that. And then this last question, it could be more for Mr. Neuendorf, not quite sure. So I do have a funding question. I know these are kind of rough sketches, so I'd say it this way: can you give us a rough idea of what we're talking about here from a funding perspective? And really interested in maybe not so much just the cost, but the how we would fund it.
Do you want me to give the cost range? And
That's a very important question. So
Thank you.
So this is very high level, and so the numbers are high level. But right now, we're estimating very roughly a cost of 15 to 20 million. That's a big number. Now, that includes the roadway improvements, the underpass improvements, also includes all the approaches to get down, which are on the developer's nickel, so to speak. So that's, I think, all in total cost, probably utilities as well, the retaining walls, hardscape, all those types of things are all bundled in there. As we move further down, that number will get more precise. So that's the cost, and then now assigning the revenue. Where's the money come from? Well, several million, I'm talking big gross generalizations here, would come from each developer, right? They're responsible for building the approaches on their respective sides of the street. So on the 7200 side, that Dinella Plaza, that's a developer cost. On the east side of the street, where the enclave and lifestyle proposal is, that initial work is the developer's cost. But when it comes to actually building the underpass and changing France Avenue, the actual roadway, that would be a city-led project. That would be a city-incurred cost, very similar to what we've done here around Eden Wilson and the Mason Green, where the developer built the building, built his own sidewalks, put in the grass, put in the curb, and then the city took over and did everything else, the roadway, the sidewalks, all the work on 50th. So we'd be looking at a similar arrangement. We would, right now, the way we've structured both of the financing for the private projects, both the 7250 site as well as the enclave lifestyle proposal you'll hear about it shortly, the majority of funding will come from tax increment financing that's generated from these new projects. We want to be safe. I think there's other federal programs that are out there. I think there's some county programs. There's probably some state programs. So we'll look at all sources. And Mike, I wonder if you want to talk to some of those opportunities.
We can get into more detail next time we meet, but there are opportunities out there, whether it's safe routes to schools or other transportation funding opportunities, I think we could take advantage of here. So that with TIF could get us a long way. I would have said 14 to 19 because that just sounds better, but I'll go with your 15 to 20. But there's a big gap because there's many unknowns. But the bridges themselves are kind of the easy part from the money perspective. We've made them very straightforward. But all that other stuff to make this iconic and special and feel like you want to be under there and you don't want to graffiti it, that's where we're like keeping some flexibility. And I wanted to just say one more thing, and it's an apology actually to Commissioner Risser. Last time we met, you asked a very specific question about, is this the right spot to cross France Avenue? And you asked us to look at that, and we did immediately when we left here. And now it's been so much time, I forgot to bring that diagram. And I will next time we meet, but I will tell you, this is a very key place to cross. And we did what's called a pedestrian watershed study. Where are pedestrians coming from? And I'll bring that next time so you can see it.
Thank you. Yep. I'm going to have Commissioner Agnew go first, and then you can go.
Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing this and for all of the work that you've put into it. I was of the overpass camp, and my concerns were, how can we make this inviting? And how can we not make this feel like you're walking under cement bridges? And I know that this is just really rough initial sketches, but because of what I'm seeing coming from the developments on both sides, the green space, that invitation to connect, I think we're on the path to solving that. So thank you for that. The only question that I have is, because of that, because of how essential the collaboration across numerous parties is for this type of project, are you seeing the buy-in and the excitement from everyone that needs to come to the table? And if not, do you see any concerns progressing with this multiple stakeholder ambitious initiative?
Yeah, I think the developers on both sides have been really wonderful in terms of being open to this, but understand they also have to make sure, there's a lot of, frightening elements of this if you're a developer, because when are we going to do this? They are on development schedule, we're on a public schedule, and we're working with the county. And so how do we make this all work? This is what I think about from a feasibility perspective. Bill is right that the developers need to spend the money in front of their developments, but you can't ask them to do it multiple times, right? So how do we manage that? And I think that is part of the discussion, depending on when this happens. How much are they investing in their landscape there? Do we kind of temper that if we know a year later we're going to be doing this? Those are the details. But they've been very cooperative. And when we had the brainstorming session on Friday, it was so fun, right? To have Terry and Jake who are doing the landscape design on both sides of the street, to have them and just brainstorm what could happen. And I think they started really seeing what Michael and I and Brad have been talking about. And then they got excited and said, oh, we could do this. And that's where this will really get special, when we start tying those designs together.
Well, you teed up the question for me. Timing. Do we know how close, I know we're threading the needle on this as well, how close we can get it to the developments?
We haven't really had that discussion with the county or anything like that, no.
Thank you.
We're just trying to make sure that it will work, because we're just realistic enough to know it probably isn't going to be precise with multiple buildings and when are they going and all of that. But just trying to manage those kind of elements and make sure it can work.
Thank you.
Commissioner Risser.
Thank you, and I appreciate knowing that information will be coming the next time we meet. The other information I would like is, and this is the perfect image to be looking at, but I would like to see what an overhead view of Centennial Lakes is between those bridges, because that was supposed to be the model and kind of make it feel airy and open. And I don't really have an accurate understanding, when I see that gap, how that compares percentage-wise in terms of open space. And if we could go to the image that shows the projection above top with the sort of IM-Pei pyramid-like forms, I do have some concerns, and I know you said this might not be the final element.
Oh, it definitely will not.
Okay, because the idea of putting, I think about how people have photographed his pyramids in front of the Louvre, and sometimes they look very substantial and sometimes very ethereal, just sort of vaporizing in space. And to have something like that on France Avenue seems a little odd. So that I am concerned about that. But I think it'll be really helpful to see how this lines up with Centennial Lakes. I am concerned about it continuing to feel like a space that may be daunting to people and they might not want to enter into it. My other concern in this is that I've had for a while, and this has to do with, is this the right site, which you're going to provide more information about, but I want to see a larger image of the site, because I want to know how people are going to access it, off of the bike trail. So I want to have an image that shows that. I want to have an image that shows how people coming from the north are going to be able to take advantage of it. And I think this is something we tend to just focus in on the single plot or the single site. And that is so counterproductive for understanding, especially when we're talking about a project that is, arguably something that is there for the community as a whole. Finally, I remember, and this, thank you, taxpayer of Edina, for sending me to the League of Minnesota Cities meeting, where I sat and listened to all of the grant applications and the sources that went into getting a bridge to its final stage. And I think the session I was in, we learned that it took 7 years to launch it. And I really want to underscore that it is so important to look at all of this, pots of money that are out there, so that this is not a, TIF-shouldered expense. And so there's that. In terms of process, I don't know, when we signed on for the $80,000 for the initial study, this is going to end up being a multi-million-dollar project. And so I don't know if there's ever a point where it goes, I mean, your firm has done a lot of work, but, how does that play in? So that's a question that I've got. And I need to go back and look at that meeting where we approved the initial study. So anyway, those are the things that I'm thinking about right now. And in part, I'm thinking about the pedestrian bridge across 62, where we had 3 different developers who came forward with a plan, and then we were able to look and select. And I think this has a lot of merit, but financing is something that I'm concerned about. A higher view is something that I'd like to see, and then maybe from staff, more information about other sources of funding and the process that we're going to use if we are moving forward. And so I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. For me personally, this is really a wonderful update. I think it's slide 5, which is the open air concept. I've loved those. Slide 5, the way those bridges and the space interact over on York Avenue with each other. I think Member Risser just made that point. And so to understand that, and we had that goal in mind when we started talking about getting across France Avenue between the 2 new developments, but to understand what the county's concerns are and the limitations we have then inherently in being able to do this. How could we do something that is both capturing the notion of getting people safely across France Avenue and also make sure that it's something that people want to use, as a point has been made, and something that's really quite appealing to people. And I think that slide 19 really captures some nice elements of it. As you look from, I think it's from west to east, looking west to east, what I would sense is that it's basically a mirror image of what you'd see looking east to west, and you get that feeling of openness and spaciousness. You can see what's on the other side. You can see how things open up. You can see the staircases. You can see people moving. You've got an elegant sort of space you're moving through that's yet to be designed. You've got light coming in from above that could probably serve a dual function of capturing natural light during the day, but also being some kind of a lighting feature in the evening, whatever the design is above France Avenue. I think one of the most significant things you've done, though, is to get the county to cooperate at some level here. And that's pretty remarkable, because over the years that I've been on the council, I have the sense that Hennepin County Engineering Department is mostly interested in throughput. And we're interested in that too, but but if we're slowing people down with fewer lanes, and making it a more pleasant experience to go down that street, that's an important consideration too, I think, from a city standpoint. It's all part of the building a better aesthetic for your town through its landscape design and its functionality. So you're doing a good job so far, I think, of capturing both form and function. So thanks.
So one thing you caused me to think about is, if in this diagram on the right side, that right northbound right turn lane into the Byerly's development, we are proposing shortening that right turn lane, because that gets us 12, 14 feet more park and less pavement, and 14 less feet you have to walk under this, right? So that's a big deal. And that one, they're not saying no, they're not saying yes, but I feel like they're leaning toward this could work. So those are just a lot of details going on still.
So Brad, thanks for your work too. I think it's nice to have the engineering aspect of it. On that particular turn into Byerly's, I think those of us that regularly travel France Avenue realize that there aren't that many people turning in there, and the people that are turning in there can get in there quickly. And so shortening it up shouldn't be, I think, a significant concession on the part of the county, but that's me. Commissioner, and I'm going to go back to one other topic.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to finish up on the financing side. So we're going to have a discussion here in a few minutes about, actually, it's always the beginning of a process. Do we want to look at TIF on a particular project? Do we want to make that inquiry, that exploration, that sort of front-end view of something? And I feel the same way here about this conversation around what are the potential sources of funding. And I know that from working on transportation matters federally, there's some significant amounts of, there are a lot of different pots of funding out there. And in fact, I sent a letter around that talks about all those different pots of funding. But I wouldn't rule out a particular source of funding just because we haven't analyzed it yet. Until we analyze it carefully, and that would include the TIF. It would be related potentially to this project on the east side, but we're a long way from anywhere on making any kind of a decision on that. But I just want to keep all doors open as we begin this conversation about A, how, if it's feasible, and B, how do we finance it if it is feasible. So, Commissioner.
So just to piggyback on that, the reason I asked the question is sometimes I think we kind of get out of sequence, and this is kind of what it feels like, and I'll probably make this comment again in a few minutes. You give us this grand idea, right? This looks fabulous, right? And then we go through and we refine developments, we all add things to it, and then you come in and you say, well, we can't build that though, unless we have whatever, $20 million in TIF. And then we have that conversation. And so I appreciate you being open and willing to be able to say, yeah, this thing right now is probably going to be somewhere between $15 and $20 million, because I think that kind of sets a frame for us to be thinking about, all right, if that's the ballpark we're in, maybe some of the things we might be asking for, we shouldn't, because we can't afford it. And so at least it puts a little bit of a constraint on the way that we are thinking about and adding to the design process. So I definitely appreciate that. And then I do think, to Mayor's point, being open to other ways of funding, which is not the designer or the engineer's issue, is definitely something that I would like to see us lean into. And so all of that being said, I actually like something big and iconic in the middle of France, like those pyramids, because I think it would be, I think in and of itself, whatever's there could also be a draw, whether it's a pyramid or something else, could be a draw for people in the confounds of, well, can we afford something like that? So, thank you.
All right.
Great.
Thank you for being here this morning, gentlemen.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
can I ask how are we doing on time? Do we have a hard stop at 9 o'clock?
I've got a virtual meeting at 9:30, so I just need 15 minutes to get where I need to be, so maybe a hard stop at 9:15 for me. I don't know everybody else's schedule. Okay.
All right, thanks.
Okay. And I know we're just at the beginning of these conversations, and they're going to be continued in the middle of August, so we got a little bit of latitude here. We're going to bring Mr. Neuendorf back up now. He's going to move on to another topic.
Yes, moving on to the main topic for this morning. I'd like to give an overview of the staff evaluation and recommendation on the use of tax increment financing to help redevelop the site at 7235 France Avenue, currently the Macy's Furniture Gallery location. But I'll run through this at a high level. The packet includes nearly 40 slides of renderings and background information. I'm not going to go through all that, but they're there for questions, just so you know that it's available.
I have a question right now.
No, go ahead, Member Russo.
Was this in our packet?
Yes.
I don't remember seeing it.
It was uploaded to the packet. Yep. Yep. So the site 7235 shown in black here. Obviously in Edina, the red line shows the school district boundary. That's oftentimes a question with TIF. So the property is in the Richfield School District. The Edina School District is right across the street in this case. Current conditions, 8-acre site. Originally the gravel and sand mining operation. That existed there for several decades until 1977 when the existing building was constructed. We have inspected the building. It has been deemed to be qualified per state statute as a substandard building, which starts the whole conversation of TIF. Before you can even start looking into it, you have to make sure that you qualify per state statute, and we have done that. Enclave Development has a site under contract to purchase. They've had a purchase contract with Macy's Real Estate for more than a year and a half now as they've been working on this proposal. And they've partnered with the folks at Lifestyle Communities to help develop one of the parcels, that southwest parcel. So I might use their names interchangeably, but we've been working quite a bit and have had many conversations with both Patrick Brahma and Ben Landhauser at those respective companies. They've been very open to sharing their information, to our prodding and pushing and asking how the financials work and how the overall structure is set up. They, of course, are here with us this morning and available for any questions after my presentation. So the preliminary site plan should look very familiar to you. This was the most recently approved site plan. And as I mentioned, the developer first came to us back in early 2023, back in March, with a sketch plan submittal. And at that time, they did make us aware that due to the lack of infrastructure on the site, due to some of those old soil conditions, that the use of TIF is probably going to be necessary just to get the conversation going. So that was known to staff, and I think as the proposal worked its way through the Planning Commission and Council, that was also mentioned. So most recently, the Planning Commission did recommend that the site plan be approved back in May. As the City Council, you granted a preliminary rezoning with a couple questions to be cleaned up in final. And for the last several months, since late March, we've been working in earnest with the developers to help understand their financials, to help and better understand what the financial gap is, what their sources are, why is a gap created, is there a way to do it any differently? And we've had a lot of those conversations that I'll summarize here today. We've got renderings of the buildings. I wanted to put this slide up. It's always important to remember that when a developer comes in to the City Council and the HRA, they need more than a single approval. So for this particular site, the first thing they need is property ownership. That's frankly the toughest thing to do in Edina, is find a piece of property that's available for sale. So they've got that box checked. The second is zoning entitlement. As we know, a lot of our properties are zoned. Their zoning designations go back generations. So that process is in play. They've got their preliminary, as I mentioned, and they're working their way towards final. And then comes the financing. They need to get their equity on board. They need to get their construction debt on board. And they've been doing that. To our satisfaction, we've had several conversations about their equity investors, the depth of their equity, the ability to actually finance this. We've seen some projects that are not able to get financing. So that's been a topic of much conversation amongst the group. Of course, they don't have anything solid in place today. Until they actually get their final rezoning, they won't even have a chance to get solid financing. But staff is certainly satisfied that those pieces will come together as this proposal works its way through the system. One thing we have confirmed as well is the offers from equity investors and from lenders is contingent upon the project providing market-based returns. And right now it does not. due to all of the public infrastructure, the lack of roadways, the lack of utilities, the fact they'll have to excavate pretty much the entire site. There is a gap, and that's why we're here today, to talk with you as the HRA board about the use of TIF to help fill that gap. And that to me is one thing that we've, as a community, have done as our policy for several generations, to use TIF to leverage that private investment. In this case, the developers are preparing to invest nearly $300 million into our community to build what's been discussed and granted approval so far, and to deliver not just that investment, but the public benefits that spill off from that. And for this project, there's a lot of benefits that have been evolving over the time. The current site plan is different than the initial site plan, and it changes based on comments and suggestions for improvement. But a lot of the space will be available to the public, both sidewalks, driveways, roadways, bike trails, landscape areas, seating areas, public art, a lot of different public benefits that would be achieved. In fact, close to 50% of the site, around 46% of the site would be covered by a public easement that would grant the general public permanent access to that facility to use those areas and enjoy those areas, while the developer would be responsible to finance them, to build them, to operate them, to maintain them in perpetuity. So that is a pretty significant benefit. The other one, tying off of what the folks from LHB just presented, it also creates this opportunity to do this underpass, to extend this promenade feel and a more comfortable pedestrian experience from the existing promenade park westerly to the Cornelia neighborhood. Not only does the site plan accommodate this, it actually welcomes it. And from a financial perspective, here is the HRA. We like to talk about the financial matters. We've set aside 25% of any future increment from this property to help fund public improvements. So if there is a decision in the future to go ahead with the underpass and the separated crossing there, we have revenue from this site as well as revenue from the site to the west to help in that effort. That's pretty significant for a project of this scale to set aside 25% of the future revenue. That's quite a boost. Of course, affordable housing, they're very happy to meet our policy when it comes to affordable housing units. That would be delivered as a combination of rental units and ownership units. If this gets approved, that would be the first time that happens in one proposal, to have ownership and rental. Shared parking is also something that they're happy to provide. The street level parking spaces in each of the 4 buildings would be designated as public parking, so that you don't have to hunt and find the right spot for you. If you're on the first floor in any of those buildings, that's the right spot. And that's something also that is recommended in our design guidelines and our Southdale experience. The developers are also willing and eager to meet our sustainability policies, certify the buildings per LEED or the National Green Building Standards. There's been a lot of conversation about that in the Planning Commission. And we also added a provision in our TIF policy that addresses who else benefits more directly from this project. So both developers are willing to satisfy that goal in our TIF policy and identify targets for the number of people that can work on the job site to make sure that there's employment opportunities for people that are typically underrepresented in the construction fields, women and people of color primarily. They've also agreeable to set targets to set aside certain amount of the subcontracted work to go to smaller businesses that are identified as either MBE or WBE firms. Now, while these are targets, they're not quotas. So there's a lot of nuances in the state law that, of course, we'll always navigate. But we've done this on our last couple TIF projects, and these developers are also willing to do it. But let's get to the financing. That's why we're really here this morning. So staff evaluates the financing with the assistance of Ellers Associates. So a lot of the numbers here are generated from Nick Anhut at Ellers. Nick, of course, is available here with us this morning. So my summary is kind of the shortened, concise version of all of Nick's generation. But projects like this are truly transformational to the community. The current site is valued at about $12 million to the tax assessor. It pays a tax bill every year of nearly $350,000. That's a lot of money. With this type of transformational change, those numbers will increase exponentially, where the future taxes to be paid increase by a factor of 10 to $3.6 million. So a lot different than just rehabbing the building or building a couple, tearing the building down and doing something smaller scale, a couple retail stores or something like that. Truly a transformational project. The TIF district would last for 25 years. So when you look at that increment, about $3 million a year over 25 years, you're looking at about $68 million in total taxes collected. Now, that's the cumulative amount. When it comes to the financing, we always look at the present value of that. And the present value of that cash flow is about $30 million. So when I mentioned that we've set aside about 25% of all the tax increment to help fund public improvements, it's 25% of $30 million. So I mean, it's a big dollar amount to help finance things that the city might like. I added this slide to look a little bit more in depth about the tax dollars and where they go today, where they would go when the TIF district is created, and then where the tax dollars go when the TIF district expires. And in redevelopment finance, it's the long game, right? I'm not so focused on what happens tomorrow. I'm more concerned about what happens 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, because that's the permanent change for the community. So I'll focus on this just for a little bit. I appreciate your patience on this as well. So today, the $350,000 tax bill. Some goes to the city, the school, the county, of course. But on commercial sites such as this, about 50% of those taxes go outside of Edina. They go into the fiscal disparities pool, and they go to the state of Minnesota. That's tax policy in Minnesota. We're not going to change it. It's not right or wrong. It's good or bad. It's not good or bad, but that's how it is. Half of the taxes paid on this site never even touch Edina. When we create a TIF district and the developer builds a project, obviously their tax bill goes up dramatically. And with TIF, remember, there's the base amount that's frozen, and then there's the increment. So a couple examples of how that actually plays out. So if you look at the city and the county on the top, $45,000 and $57,000, that's the base amount. It stays about flat. They're still paying their share, but it's not adjusted. The school district is adjusted. So even with the TIF district in place, the amount of tax dollars that would be redistributed to the schools increased from $62,000 to over $400,000. The state of Minnesota goes up a little bit. The fiscal disparities pool goes up a little bit. But the biggest chunk of dollars during the active years of the TIF district, $2.7 million, that's the increment that stays within to help reimburse the developer for all the public benefits we ask them to build for us, as well as any public improvements like an underpass or anything else that's relevant that the city would choose to build. So for the active years, that's about 25 years, not a short period of time, but during that time, most of the taxing entities are either neutral or increase the tax collection, but the biggest amount does stay within the site. And then let's look at post-TIF. It's the long game. It's why we look at some of these big transformational projects in Edina. Year 26, the TIF district is finished. All the tax base is still there. You still have buildings, they're 20-some years old, but they're still solid buildings that are going to be on the tax rolls for a while. This is where it gets really interesting. So the tax collection by the city increases from $45,000 to almost $900,000. The county, similar scale. The school district more than doubles. The state, the fiscal disparities, the smaller taxing agencies, they all go up because the money doesn't need to go into the TIF district any longer. So this is a very simplistic comparison. We did not adjust for inflation. We made a lot of assumptions like every taxing agency just does the same thing and they don't jockey their numbers. And we all know that nothing's static, right? There's always change. There's always going to be inflation. But I wanted to provide a quick overview of how TIF works before, during, and after. Because I think it's essential to have that long view when we look at these proposals. So we did confirm in the first step of our evaluation that there is revenue generated and enough to actually make a difference. We then start looking at the developer's numbers, at their construction numbers and their pro formas. Not going to go through this in detail, but in each of the parcels, the northwest parcel is about 56 million. The east parcels, those are the two buildings right on the promenade. That's just shy of $150 million investment. And then the condominium building on the southwest corner, about $95 million. As I mentioned, we have confirmed that there are a combination of internal and external equity investors that are ready to invest in this project if the pieces come together. And also we've received letters from banking institutions and mortgage lenders that are interested in the project, assuming the pieces come together. When we look at TIF for any specific project, we also look to confirm the gap and to make sure that there's enough public benefit to justify TIF. And so that's what this chart shows. Now, there's always a big difference. State law would recognize over $100 million as TIF qualified. Edina policy is a lot different. We look at a much smaller subset than the state law would allow. So in this case, we recognize about $26.8 million as direct costs that provide a public benefit to the community that would be delivered by this project. Now, we're not recommending that we pledge $26 million. I'm just saying that that's the public benefit that we've calculated. We actually size the TIF recommendation based on their need. We want to fill the gap to make the project doable and financeable. So there's a sheet like this for each of the three phases. I'll just go through one as the example. And again, this is a very simplification of the numbers. If you want to get in more detail, Nick would be happy to bend your ear and answer questions about that. But when you look at the operational expenses to see does this project make sense financially, you're looking at the revenue stream, the gross income from rent, fees, and commercial rent. You're looking at the annual operating costs, management, paying their taxes, paying their light bill, everything else. You then you compare those two or subtract the expenses from the revenue to get your net operating cost, and you find that the return based on just expenses and revenue is about 5.51% below market. So that's not an acceptable return. You can go down to U.S. Bank today and get 5%. So real estate investors with risk will not settle for a 5% return. So that's where we've confirmed that a TIF supplement, a TIF reimbursement of part of the expenses would be necessary to actually secure those equity and debt investors into this project. So the conclusion is the same for each of the three parcels. Without TIF support, we don't think any of those three elements would be financially viable. We have looked at them individually. We wanted to be precise just in case, maybe one of them was a grand slam. Maybe the east parcels, their returns were outrageous. So we analyzed each of the three separately and confirmed the same thing, that based on the projections that are available today in this marketplace, without TIF, none of these buildings would be financially feasible. And that's how we get to our recommendation. So there's a term sheet in your packet that was prepared by Dorsey and Whitney. They provide our legal guidance on this. Jay Lindgren helped prepare the term sheet. And of course, Jay is here to answer any questions as well. So I'm not going to go through the whole term sheet. There's 40-some pages. It's in your packet. But I will cover the high points. And the biggest point I want to make is that in these TIF recommendations, we make sure that the developer bears the financial risk. So it's their risk to get the property under contract, to line up the equity, to line up the debt, to get all the entitlements and all that work that costs millions. We're also recommending that the developer pursue grants to see if there's other ways to offset some of the costs on this project. We think there's grants from DEED, Met Council, and Hennepin County that might be applicable. They're competitive, there's no guarantee we're going to get them, but we'd like the developer to pursue them. We're also presuming that the developer finances each of these 3 lots, the northwest, the east, and the southwest, independently. So that means that the equity investors and the mortgage lender might be different on all 3 projects. We want to make sure they've got the maximum flexibility to get the best terms out there in the marketplace. We've also made sure that the developer would be mandated to issue public easements upon completion. It's nice to have green space, but if there's not a legally binding contract, it's just pretty green space. We want to make sure that it's public green space. From the city perspective, the obligations we would be expecting or recommending is that we give consideration to establish a new 25-year redevelopment TIF district, and that upon completion, we would plan to pledge TIF notes, pay-as-you-go TIF notes, 1 for each of the 3 projects. So when they finish the project, we would confirm the gap, confirm the financing, and then issue a note. That note would be payable from property taxes collected from that 1 parcel. So if they pay the property taxes that we project, their note gets paid off. If they pay less, taxes go down in the future. That's their risk. They don't get paid off. If they pay more taxes than we're projecting, they get paid off early and we're finished. So that's the typical arrangement, and that's a real simplification of it. But we've set up a structure for separate notes for each parcels. Again, wanted to reiterate that we've sized each of these notes in the whole TIF district to ensure that there's about 25, or at least 25% of the tax increment would be available to the city to fund public infrastructure, like an underpass or other related improvements. And the whole term sheet, again, is based on the premise that the financial risk is borne by the developer, not by the city, not by the HRA. We also have general provisions in the term sheet to look at look-backs and clawbacks. We still need to negotiate these based on final construction numbers that we don't have yet, but I wanted to provide assurance that per our TIF policy, we, the city, will have the ability to peek at the developer's numbers at specific points in time in the future to make sure that they really do need the money. And if we find that, for example, let's say they sell the property at an outrageous a profit, it's the best sale in generations, well, then they didn't need TIF. And we'd have the ability to either terminate payments or claw back any of the money we gave to them. So the developer doesn't like that part of the conversation. That's been one of the toughest ones. But that's our policy, and we will do that. So just wanted to assure you that that would be included. And then, of course, when it comes to all the public spaces, all those public benefits, we envision a whole series of binding easements that run with the land. So whoever owns it at whatever point in time in the future, there'd be a binding covenant or easement that gives the public rights and access to those spaces, the parking, the sidewalks, the trails, the affordable housing, et cetera. So to summarize, as you know, the project's wielded its way through the Planning Commission and the sketch plan and the neighborhood meetings to City Council. We've confirmed that there's a number of public benefits that people generally like to see on the site. We've affirmed that there is sufficient revenue generated based on their scale of investment. We've confirmed independently that there truly is the financial gap in their budgets. And we've also confirmed that the property does qualify as a blighted or substandard building. As we've prepared the term sheet, we've also kept an eye to state law. That's where Mr. Lindgren comes in to make sure we're following the law as well as our own internal policies. And that brings me to our recommendation. And that's where I recommend that we do move forward with the term sheet. Consider the establishment of a new TIF district. That process takes 2 or 3 months. My recommendation is that we start that process. Doesn't mean that we're going to reach a successful conclusion, but we need to start that process just because it takes so long. Recommend is to approve the term sheet as written, recognizing the maximum TIF contribution of about $22.8 million, delivered through a bunch of pay-as-you-go TIF notes upon completion. It's not a subsidy. This would be an incentive. If they perform, if they deliver, then they get the pay-go notes. If they fail to perform, they fail to deliver, they get nothing. And so I seek your authorization to move forward and actually finish the legal contracts based on these terms. That work will take another 2.5 months as well. So we'd like to get started on that if this is something that you're agreeable to. So that's where I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair. Myself, Jay Lindgren, Nick Anhut, happy to answer any questions. The development team of Patrick Brahma and Ben Landhauser also here for any questions. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Newendorf. I'm going to bring Mr. Lindgren up here and ask him to give us a little bit more structure around what you called the process, which you touched on just generally, so that we understand. I think Commissioner Pierce, I think I know what direction he's heading in, and that is, the council just made a preliminary approval on the project, but no, you didn't have a final approval in front of us yet as a council. And now here we are as an HRA sitting here talking about potential use of TIF. I personally know from having been involved in this that it's a lengthy process before you ever get to a decision point, but I think we should have a little bit more structure around what's involved in that process and where the public voice comes into play and where the voice of the Richfield School District comes into play. Those types of things, if that's enough guidance for you.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Commissioners, good to see you. Good to be here today. Without putting a calendar schedule on it, what I would say, and I appreciate sort of the rhythm, if you will, that we've developed over time by asking you to look at a very detailed term sheet. We've developed a 40-page document in order to say, okay, is the general direction going correctly? This is not a commitment at this point in time, and there are several looks at this again before a final decision is made. As Mr. Newendorf mentioned, if you move toward a establishment of tax increment district, that takes time. So you will be asked to consider calling the date for the public hearing, but that's not a commitment to establish the TIF district yet. Our next step is to take this 40-page document and make it into potentially a several hundred-page document that includes all of the details on how the easements would be structured and all the mechanics of everything. And that would come back to you again. And again, remember that the development team supplies the city, the HRA, with the resources, the monetary resources to develop that work. And so that will take some time. At the end of the day, from a timing standpoint, as we not just look out for the city's interests, but try to form this partnership with the developer, we have to look at what their reality is on real estate closings. And in the term sheet you have right now, they have a schedule to close on the real estate acquisition from Macy's between the middle of December and the end of March. And so that's sort of the realistic marketplace timeline, is that these additional steps that we need to go through should wind up giving them direction on whether or not you agree this is the right strategy by sometime, at least by early December, say. Does that help,
As
Mr.
we go
Chair?
through this deliberation process of thinking about whether we want to apply TIF to this project and enter into an agreement, there's an opportunity in there, I think multiple opportunities for I'll call it the public voice to be heard, not just our voices representing the public, but the public itself and then the various taxing entities that are potentially affected by this. How does that work?
So each of the taxing entities, and actually Mr. Anhut knows this better than I do, so he might correct something, but in general, they're all given notice of it, so they have the same kind of numbers that Mr. Newendorf talked about. They will hear about it. You have public hearing involved for the actual establishment of the TIF district. The redevelopment agreement would need to come before you for approval, in whatever form of public participation you want. So there are at least those, two very specific times before you as the elected officials in the city, and that would occur over the next few months.
So though we're potentially entering into a term sheet, it's more like what we would might, in the legal business, an LOI. It's a letter of intent. It's a non-binding agreement, but you have to have something to go forward from, a structure from, to see if a deal could be made somewhere down the line.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, maybe I should have said it more clearly. What I like about the term sheet is you're making no commitment now other than, to participate and to communicate. There's no contractual obligation at all at this point, and it's really the question of you're giving your direction to your team to say, okay, those ideas in general are the right thing, flesh out the rest of it so we can take another look. That's really what we're asking for, the recommendation, not really to approve anything. It's to say, okay, you're generally going in the right direction, keep going.
Mr. Neuendorf, anything to add to that?
The only thing to add is that in addition to the formal process of the TIF evaluation by the school district and the county, and of course the city, we'll also post that to the Better Together website. That's been our common practice. We specifically set up this process to make sure that the TIF conversation comes in the right sequence, and that there is public opportunity to both be informed and to provide comments on that. So we specifically staggered the term sheet to come after the preliminary zoning approvals, because, for example, if the preliminary approval was declined, we wouldn't even be here this morning. So we staggered it that way intentionally. And the same with the final redevelopment agreement. They need to come in and get their final zoning first. And if that is granted, then we would come in after the fact with the redevelopment agreement. But we have staggered it in a way that we can do two things at once, because the entitlement process, it's going on about 18 or 20 months already just to get through the zoning. And so if we waited till everything was buttoned up to start the TIF conversation, you're adding another 6 to 9 months to the process. The real estate industry doesn't move that slowly, so we have to be responsive to the fact that they're moving at the market pace.
Turn to Commissioner Pierce, who has some process questions too, I think.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So thanks for that overview. I've got a couple of questions. Actually, could you go to slide 21 before I talk about process? So this is, I think this is the clearest slide I have seen, and it has something in here that we hear all the time that you are articulating and kind of blowing through, and I mean in a positive way. And so, but I want you to kind of talk through it. And so here's the question. So you have the current tax collection, and that's an annual number.
Correct.
And then your next column talks about active TIF district. So that's once a project is done, that's during the 25-year period, right? And
Correct.
So for the Richfield School District, we're showing that currently it's 62,000. At the start of the TIF district, it's almost $500,000. And then at the end of the TIF district, it almost doubles again. And so just talk about how that is. Is that a fair question?
It is a fair question. So I'll talk in generalities, and then I'll ask Nick to get into a little bit more detail. But in general, I think I would guess that in every state in America, when TIF comes up, one of the biggest complaints is, you're stealing textbooks from my kids, you're stealing computers from the school kids. Over the 50-plus years that TIF has been used in Minnesota, the state legislation that governs TIF is changed virtually every year. There's always something tweaked in there. And a lot of the adjustments have been with an eye to that concern about, are you hurting the school district? So there's a whole flurry of legislation that's been around for quite some time and it gets modified to counteract that concern. And I'll ask Nick to speak a little bit about why it changes for the school district, market value versus tax capacity value, and get into the weeds a little bit more.
Thank you, Commissioners. Nick Anhut with Ellers and Associates Financial Advisors to the City and the HRA. And I prepared the numbers for this slide, perhaps in a little bit more convoluted sense than Bill simplified and made it much easier to swallow. The simple fact relies on that tax increment does not statutorily capture all of the levies that are adopted by various bodies. When a TIF district is established, the base value or the amount that the property is contributing to your tax base is frozen and will continue to provide funding just as it does before the TIF district is established. It continues to provide that same tax capacity throughout the life of the TIF district. It also does not capture what's called a referendum market value tax base. And that is specifically impactful to the school districts because they have several levies that fund their programs that are based on that referendum market value within the community. So when a new project in a TIF district comes forward, it has tax capacity that comes onto the system. Not all of it gets captured for purposes of that. Their referendum market values continue to flow and increase. I would put a caveat that it doesn't mean necessarily that the school district is going to get extra budgetary dollars. It just means that this property now is going to be contributing much more than it was in the past, lowering everyone else's tax bills throughout that jurisdiction. The school district, and I hope that we'll get into this in a discussion with the HRA in the future, they have other mechanisms that might constrain their ability to actually increase their budgets, primarily enrollment. And so it doesn't mean that they're going to get extra money, but it does mean that this property is going to be contributing way more than it was in the past, and then the rest of their tax base needs to contribute less. Also, the state of Minnesota fiscal disparity pools, those are not captured within the TIF district, so those revenues continue to fund those programs and the way that they're utilized. And then at the end of the day, once everything is decertified, whether that's 25 years from now or 20 if it's earlier, all of that tax base comes onto the regular tax capacity rolls and then helps contribute to the levies that are adopted at that point in time. I think that addresses your question, but I'd be happy to dive into more detail.
I would, at a later date, want to dive into that a little bit more. I definitely understand you're saying there's a difference between what expenses a school district may need from a budgetary standpoint and what's available. That's kind of how I hear you describing that. And so this project would contribute more to what's potentially available, but then the district would look at, well, how much do we actually need to spend from a budgetary standpoint? So I definitely understand that. But I would like to dive into that a little bit more at a future date. And then just briefly, since we've got I think we got a hard stop. Oh, sorry.
Just very quickly, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that date is going to be August 15th. Mr. Neuendorf and I had some discussions with Ellers staff. They're putting together a presentation for us for our HRA meeting on that morning.
Yeah.
I've already invited the school superintendents to join us that day so we can all kind of hear the same thing at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you, Manager Neal. And then just briefly on the process standpoint, I started talking about that earlier this morning. I like the time frame that we kind of just discussed. And I don't know who to credit this to. I'm sure Manager Neal will tell me who we should give the kudos to. But I actually like the fact that we had developer come in to talk about how to connect these sites. We had the developer of the 7200. They were in the back to kind of hear some of that. And now we also have the Macy site. And so you can kind of step back and imagine the entire piece, although they're all separate projects. I think that does add some credence to how we talk about public benefit more broadly, because you can kind of step back and see all of that and imagine what that potential could be. But because of that, I do like the idea of thinking, I can't remember who said this, but December to March, right? I think that gives us more time than we probably need to just make sure we can tick the boxes on all of these projects before making a decision on TIF. And then the other comment I'll make, just in our notes, saying that Dorsey, Whitney, and Ellers were you're asking us to prepare a TIF redevelopment. I don't know if I like the word prepare, but I understand that you've got a 40-page document that you need to do a lot more due diligence with to be able to actually bring back to us so that we can ask even deeper questions about what's in there and how it all gets allocated and what have you. And so I think that makes sense. In general, my preference would be that we understand way up front just some relative idea of how much public funding we might need for a particular project. And I think it's unfair to the developer. We go so far down the road in terms of sketch plan review with the Planning Commission, and we do preliminary approvals, and we get pretty far down the road before we have some sketch out of what we think the public benefit might be. And in future, I'd like for us to think about how we can adjust that just a little bit. But I do thank you, Mr. Lindgren, for coming up and kind of talking through that process. That's it.
Yeah, Commissioner, let me ask you a quick question. Around the word prepare, I was thinking about that as you mentioned that and wondering if the language, if we did pass a motion, that we would authorize staff to engage Dorsey and Whitney and others to draft a proposed form of TIF redevelopment agreement. Mm-hmm. If that language is something that creates more comfort for you around,
yeah,
in lieu of the word use of the word prepare. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Commissioner Jackson and then Commissioner Risser.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it's 9:01. I have 2 pages of questions about this term sheet. And then as we're talking, I have questions about our assessment process. Could probably be a 45-minute conversation. So I don't know. I'm very frustrated right now, extremely frustrated. So I don't know how to go about getting answers to my questions. Some of these terms I really disagree with. So I'm not willing to vote yes today. So I don't know what to do. We don't have time to get my list of questions.
Let's talk about that. Is there a reason this can't be held over to the 15th of August for further discussion?
There's no major reason. I think that can work. I'm aware the developer has some deadlines to meet. One of the deadlines is this Friday, is my understanding. Maybe that can get changed on his calendar. I'm not certain, but a 2-week delay to the city is not a problem. To the developer, it'll probably be expensive, but to the city, that's agreeable to the city.
Because I will say, as this is written, I'm going to vote no. So I'm going to have to see some changes. I have some big questions about the but-for test. It seems like complying with the Southdale guidelines is the but-for test. The way I read this, so I'm just going to give you the general questions I've got. The way I read it is that the subdivision of the land and putting those connector spaces, whether they're streets or paths, is very much of what the but-for, what triggers the but-for test for TIF. And I'm very concerned that when we went through the Southdale process and the land use side of this, this will pay for itself. We'll allow this bigger redevelopment. There's no step backs at the higher levels on these buildings. That's something that is encouraged in the Southdale guidelines. it's more profitable for the developer to not have the step backs, and yet we're still seeing that this isn't going to pay for itself. I'm really concerned about this, that what we have put forth as land use terms seem to automatically trigger TIF. I'm concerned about the parking. I think if you're going to have shops, you're going to need parking. And to say that that's public is nice, but the public's going to be coming to go to the shops anyways. And so I don't know how that's any different from the private lot in the south, in the property to the south. They have shops, they have parking for their shops. I can go there, I'm a member of the public, I park and I shop. These are going to be parking spots. I'm going to go there, I'm going to park, and I'm going to shop. I don't see why that makes it extra special that we should fund it. I don't see anything in here about the language we've talked about with complying with labor standards. I very much want to see that in any document that we go forward with. The assessment, if we're paying taxes, or if the property is paying taxes based on a $12 million assessment, but this property probably sold for close to double that, why does our assessment so far below what the market value of this property is? And it's the same with the Kevin Keys site, right? You look at the assessment and what they're offering for it in the market, it's, double. So I don't understand how our assessment process works when these sites come up for sale. It doesn't seem fair to the taxpayers. And like I said, there's just some specific things in here that I have questions about. How some of the affordable housing things work, the fixed versus floating, how it works in the condominiums. There's no detail on how that's going to remain affordable. So I can send you my list of questions, but they're long, and some of them are very detailed, but some of them are big policy questions that I'm really struggling with. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
It seems to me that there should be a conversation, I won't call it necessarily a private conversation, but I think a staff conversation with any commissioner that has any concerns about the term sheet, and it's nice to have had time to react to that and have those conversations so that when we came to a public setting, things were more streamlined and effective, is what point you're getting at, I think, too. You were going to say something, and member, sir?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on Member Jackson. I think she did a wonderful job of kind of talking through what I term, there are some policy challenges, there's some design challenges as well that you described that impact what would be or could be in a term sheet. And so I just think that is a really good example of why, from a process standpoint, I think we do need to take the time to go through that. You could send your questions, which you probably should, but I think we would all benefit from hearing and seeing some of that as well. So I don't necessarily think we should do it from a private standpoint. We should hear those answers in a public forum. And I didn't go through my list of questions either. And so I think it just underscores the need to make sure we have the time to go through all of that.
All right. Yeah, when I said a staff-driven conversation between the commissioner and the staff, I was assuming it was that when it came then to the full conversation, we'd have the benefit of all of those questions being answered in a public manner. So we have transparency. Member Risser, Commissioner Risser.
I share Commissioner Jackson's frustration, and for me, because we're running out of time, I'm going to focus on Attachment A, the project site plan. And while I am sympathetic to the deadlines of the developer, I do want to underscore that it was me raising a concern about the France Avenue access from the sidewalk not being ADA compliant. And for that to be something that, and I did it as a city council person, for that to be something that a city council person has to raise at a time when we are under DOJ investigation for not being ADA compliant, possibly not being ADA compliant on the Grandview pedestrian bridge, is just, to me, mind-boggling. And so that, I think, was a bump in the road that the developer should not have placed there. The other thing is, as you go back and you look at how these plans are being presented, that dog park was supposed to be open space. It becomes a dog park very late in the game. And I know that when we talked about the preliminary rezoning, there wasn't the word preliminary in front of the site plan. And so now we have in this document that you want us to push forward a site plan that does not appear to have ADA compliance along France Avenue, that has a dog park. There were, I believe, 8 things that we were concerned about when we approved that preliminary rezoning. And I don't see those reflected in the information that is going to go out in this TIF proposal. So I have a really big problem with that. And I think this cycles back to the very initial concerns that were raised by Member Pierce, the sequence of events. We don't have the final project plan. You know, so what are we doing here? And I know we did get along, you can just kind of go back and sort of this infinity loop of explaining and all of that, but I don't think it's fair to the public for us to move this forward. And the other thing that I am concerned about in terms of process, this came out on Monday, and I looked at the packet, and this is in the packet, so my apologies for raising that as a question, but when I looked, I only saw the term sheet, and that could have been me being disrupted by my dog, who knows what, but, so I want to apologize to staff for raising that concern. It does not appear to have been legitimate, but these other things, really we need to look at these, and then we were concerned about a wind study. We're talking about a TIF investment that's going to last 25 years. For architecture, 75% of it, and I've learned the term stick construction, it's not concrete. When you think about these 7-story buildings and all the wind over a period of over a quarter of a century, what exactly are we going to have at the end of that period? I'm also trying to wrestle with the idea of blighted property. The Macy's furniture store is an upscale furniture store, and I know it has repeatedly been referred to as a bunker. I think it is a remarkable piece of architecture from that era when earth reinforcement was something that people did. And when you walk into that Macy's furniture store, it certainly does not feel like blighted property. So those are my concerns, and I, as with my colleague, I can't see pushing this forward. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation and the queries from my colleagues, but I just want to reiterate, I think that that's like the phase of the process that we're in. And I do hear Commissioner Pierce there may be some opportunities that we have as a city to begin to reorder some of these things more holistically so that we can have insight into it earlier on. But I just want to remind everyone that we're on like phase 1 of many phases, and I think that that's exactly what folks were looking for, right? What are our concerns? What things do we want to see tweaked? So I think that this was valuable discussion, and I hope that it's just enough to bring forward. There are no kind of additional components, but just want to appreciate all of the work that's gone into it up until this point, and know that we will iterate and have many, 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 many more conversations about this project and TIF financing in particular. Thank you.
Though the proposed term sheet is a non-binding agreement, the fact that Commissioner Jackson and Commissioner Pierce has mentioned as well concerns about some of the elements of it, you want to make sure that the structure of the proposed term sheet matches up, because when you get into discussions about a proposed agreement, people often reference back to, well, it's not in the LOI, or it's in the LOI this way, and so these concerns that she hasn't been able to articulate because of the time frame involved are probably things that we do need to talk about before we do have a term sheet. So that the term sheet reflects what we think a potential deal downstream, fleshed out with more skin on the bone, if you will, would look like. But those key elements, even though it's non-binding, I think are really beneficial to have in a term sheet. So how do we deal with that issue? I don't know what kind of situation we're in with the developer, but you can tell from the tenor of the conversation up here that it's something that we're uncomfortable, some of us are uncomfortable moving forward with this morning. And until we have a more thorough conversation about the elements, at least of the term sheet. Some of the other things that we've talked about, I think, can be dealt with, as Commissioner Agnew says, downstream, because of the non-binding nature of this, and there will be elements that come into it. And there could be things that we make a decision on as a council that relate to the final development plan and site plan that cause certain things to be altered here as well. So the question is, can we wait till the middle of August to have this conversation again, or have a special meeting in a couple of weeks? I guess that is a couple of weeks. We're at the end of the month.
Right. If I could respond to a couple of those items. So we have the next scheduled meeting on August 15th. We could set that up as a joint meeting to finish this conversation about the term sheet, take action if you're so inclined, and still have half the meeting to talk about TIF with the school folks. And then we can push down the road a conversation about the underpass to get, I think we had a lot of discussion this morning, so maybe you got your questions answered on that one today, but we can push that down the road. I don't want to speak for the developer. They would prefer an answer sooner than later, but from a city HRA process perspective, pushing it down the road a couple weeks is no problem. So if that's your inclination, that's fine. And the term sheet itself, we strived not to get into matters of zoning or site plan. And staff was tempted on many occasions to do that. But we really try to keep the HRA operating in the lane of financing and leave the planning, zoning, site plan review to the city council. So how we typically do these TIF packets is the term sheet just includes the most recently approved site plan. We just drop it in there. The actual redevelopment agreement, the legal contract that's binding, if we get to that point, would have the final site plan as approved in a couple weeks or a couple months. So we intentionally did not get into details of where's the dog park and what's the slope of the ramp, and we intentionally omitted those areas. But substantive questions or concerns, I'm happy to talk on those one-on-one or as a group. We're certainly able to revise that term sheet. Always be aware that a term sheet is intended to be concise. So when it comes to matters like the long-term affordability of a future condominium unit, that's a whole nother 30-page document. We didn't want to prepare that document if you're not even agreeable to the concept. So the term sheet focuses on the concepts. I think one of the last pages of the term sheet lists exhibits A through P that we currently envision would need to be created. And so I hope you'd have faith in staff and our advisors that with your consent to move forward at some point in time, that you'd eventually get a full packet that has all the exhibits, that has all the details flushed out. We're just not at that point today, but happy to get there.
Yeah, so it seems to me that there's a couple different possibilities. One is we have a work session and go through this together, or folks that have concerns, commissioners that have concerns about elements of the term sheet, they send to you in advance so that you can prepare answers to those questions or have conversations with them so that we can have a conversation in the public arena about those various concerns. But it is important to have the time to be able to flesh all of this out. So I'm just going to use this by way of example, is that if Commissioner Jackson had a point that would be covered more thoroughly in the subsequent document and not in the detail we'd expect in the term sheet, then that'd be a good thing to know. But until she asks the question and we have the conversation, how are you going to know? And she also may have some things on her list that haven't even been thought of that are potential additions to the term sheet, we're just understanding elements of the term sheet better for all of us, so. Based on that and the significance of this potential project that was preliminarily approved by the council, what do you suggest we do here is in terms of having a study session together to go over the elements of the term sheet, which we usually leave to you and professional staff, or do you want to have these little one-off conversations and then we deal with it all on the 15th?
My recommendation would be to do kind of a hybrid. If you've got a list of questions or 2 pages of questions, I'm eager to know what those are, and I can start preparing responses or edits. We can do that informally in the next couple days or week, but then come back as a group on the 15th and show the changes and make sure that your colleagues hear your questions as well. My concern is if we wait to the 15th to start the conversation, we're now going to have to kick it down the road another month to actually get answers to those questions.
We all agree with that. We all understand that. Member, Commissioner Risser.
My problem is that we do not have, our most recent approved site plan does not appear to have ADA compliant access from France Avenue. And so we need to have a site plan that shows that, and that needs to be passed by council. And so, we can have all of these conversations regarding, and we do need to have all those conversations regarding council or Commissioner Jackson's concerns, but we need to have a site plan that has ADA access, and that needs to happen. So
what's your reaction to that concern?
My concern would be, well, I guess my reaction is that we're happy to modify the term sheet to make reference that this is a placeholder image to be replaced with the final version. That would be my recommendation. My concern is if we wait till the final site plan is finished, 2 concerns. That could be a couple months away. I think that kills the project. And also the final site plan that's approved through zoning is not the construction plan. There's still 2 layers of construction detail. So the zoning, even the final zoning plan, it shows it has more detail, but the real plan that they actually build to is still probably 6 months down the road. So I guess at some point that's where the building department gets involved, the engineering department gets involved. That's when everyone gets into all the detail. But certainly the final site plan that's approved would be closer, but it's still not the final detail. So if we wait even longer, at some point, you just have to act and presume that the professional staff and professional architects and engineers that put their licenses and careers on the line are doing the right thing.
Mr. Lindgren, you have any comment on the concern with the site plan or the suggestion Mr. Neuendorf is making relative to the kind of a holding spot in the term sheet, or the relevance of the site plan to the work you're doing relative to the term sheet?
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I agree with what Mr. Neuendorf said. When we're crafting this for your consideration as the HRA, we only yield to your decisions as the City Council. That's not decided in this. And so whatever the ultimate decision and the modifications necessary in the site plan, that would tie back to this document. And I was just actually looking for the language because I think we always put it in here that we say anything that comes out of the redevelopment agreement that might flow out of this term sheet is subject to the final zoning and land use approvals adopted by the City Council. So in my mind, this doesn't determine any of that, and there's still time to modify it, and it always would be done that way. It would only tie to what your final approvals are.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Mr. Chair.
Go
ahead. I think what we're talking about here, though, is what are your kind of immediate next steps? And I think your immediate next steps is if we can get some questions prior to our August 15th meeting, we would have the opportunity to respond to those and share those responses with the commission prior to the start of that meeting, certainly. We can structure that meeting. We didn't structure that meeting with the entire meeting dedicated to school district, city, TIF. We told that our guests that we were going to reserve half the meeting, so we can still sort of I think we can still accomplish that. And still table some of the discussion and possible possible action by the council to that meeting.
What kind of a time situation are we in with respect to 72nd in France, number 3 TIF district? Was the next item on the agenda.
So based on the comments today, I'd recommend we table that resolution, of course. But what that resolution says, it asks that the city council schedule a future meeting. But it sounds like we need to look at the dates, and if you're not comfortable with finishing the term sheet conversation, I don't think you'll be comfortable approving that resolution. So what that means, the consequence is that the process would be delayed, at least a couple weeks. It's not the end of the world.
Okay. And there's no exigency there. We can put that off a little bit.
Right.
Okay. All right. So I think that probably concludes our work this morning. Anything else?
No, nothing else.
Commissioners or from the executive director? All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Agnew moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds that we adjourn the meeting of the HRA this 25th day of July, 2024. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. HRA meeting of July 25, 2024 stands adjourned.